Welcome. As you can see, all these beautiful ladies on stage are busy seeing their color coordinated outfits. And it has been, though unplanned, beautifully color coordinated, as you can see. It's a nice, unusually warm for January winter morning, I have to say. And we weren't expecting it to be quite as warm as this. We were hoping that we'd be enjoying a much cooler Sunday morning on the town hall steps. But we can't control the weather. So thank you very much for coming out today and for joining us on the last morning of the APJ Kolkata Literary Festival held in association with Times of India. We've had 3 packed days of really interesting and exciting events, and today promises to be no less. We'd like to begin this morning's program with the session titled Love for Sale, which is around the launch of this exciting new book edited by Ruchira Gupta. The book itself contains stories from all over the country in about 12 to 14 Indian languages translated into English, consisting of a wonderful culling of some of the best fiction that's been written around the theme of the prostituted and trafficked woman. And it's very exciting to have a book like this released at this festival and to wish it on its journey, which I hope will be a long and successful one. Before we launch into the panel discussion, we'd like to do the all-important task of actually launching the book. And today we have with us 2 leaders from Sonagachi, Rumki and Payal, who are going to come up here and actually unveil the book for us. Can we have the packed copies? Yeah. Rumki, Payal, তোমরা আসতে পারে কোথায় বসে আছে এই তো এসে গেছে আচ্ছা এটা খুলে দাও খুলে সবাইকে দেখিয়ে দাও tear the paper ছিঁড়ে দাও হ্যাঁ ছিঁড়ে দাও এইভাবে নমস্কার আমরা সবাই দাঁড়াই হ্যাঁ আমার কাছে Thank you very much. Thank you. চলো তোমরা এই বই রাখতে চাইবে হ্যাঁ I asked them. Would you কিছু বলতে চাইবে হ্যাঁ বলবেন বলুন
হ্যালো আমরা আপনা আপ থেকে আসছি ঠিক আছে যে আপনা আপ থেকে আসছি যে কারণে আমরা আপনা আপ থেকে সাহানা দিয়ে আমাদেরকে প্রথম সাহায্য করে ঠিক আছে তারপর আমরা নিজেরা নিজের থেকে যখন সাহানাদি বলল তোমরা নিজেরা এই রাস্তায় আসছো তোমাদের বাচ্চাদের কি করবে আমরা বললাম যে আমাদের বাচ্চাকে আমরা এই রাস্তায় নিয়ে আসবো না ঠিক আছে আমরা চাই আমরা নিজেরা খারাপ হয়েছি আর বাচ্চারা খারাপ না হোক আর কোনো মেয়েরা খারাপ না হোক কারণ এখানে চাকরি বাধা বলে মেয়েদেরকে নিয়ে আসে এনে বিক্রি করে দেয় মেয়েদেরকে তারপর এই রাস্তায় তাদের নামতে হয় আমরা চাই যেতে আমরা খারাপ হয়েছি আর 5টা মেয়ে খারাপ না হোক আর 5টা বাচ্চা খারাপ না হোক আপনার থেকে আসছি আপনারা যদি বাচ্চাদের সাহায্য করেন আরও 5টা মেয়েকে সাহায্য করেন তাহলে তারাও মানুষ হবে তারা আমাদের মতন রাস্তায় যাবে না এজন্য আপনাদের কাছে ধন্যবাদ আর আপনারা সাহায্য করবেন আর 5টা বাচ্চাকে আর 5টা মেয়েকে
খুব সুন্দর এই তোমার ফোন পায়েল নাও Thank you. That was a very emotional start to what actually is an extremely emotional subject. And I would like to invite Aparna Sen, one of the finest readers I have ever had the privilege of listening to. It's very rare, actually, to hear her read aloud. And we are very, very lucky that she has agreed to take time out to do this with us. Reenadi is going to now read one of the stories from the book which has been selected by her. See if it's working. I think it's on.
Good morning. This story is called The Last Customer. It's by Niranjana. Niranjana? Niranjana. No one was willing to go beyond the intersection. The ceaseless expanse of buildings and the cool breeze over the plains brought along a foul odor. A few stood there, creating a busy hum of gossip, a confusing medley of sounds. As the sun came up, the weather turned warm. Those who could not avoid the intersection walked past in a hurry, glancing to their left for an instant and then not raising their heads at all. Everyone was busy while walking past. No one seemed to have any time for this. Eventually, the news reached the municipal offices. Kani woke up in the middle of the night to see that her partner, who had been sleeping beside her, was missing. The girl of 16 had come running after the boy just 10 days earlier to the capital of Karnataka from some place in Tamil Nadu. He was a rag picker with a blunt stump in the place of an arm. One of those nights, he pulled her into an embrace using his other arm. She looked at him with a shudder in her heart. She looked at his arm, an arm which had the strength of two. That night, they eloped. She had a house, a small hut. Her parents had worked on a piece of land as tenants. The same year, they lost everything. The patriot that he was, the landlord had asked for a higher tenancy, failing which, he said, he would give away the tilling rights to someone else. And that is exactly what happened. Kani's parents lost their piece of land. The family migrated with their remaining pots and pans. The elder son decided to become a coolie and went away to Madras. The younger one fought with the parents and left home. With a mute girl hanging at their breast, the parents flitted from one town to another. They would not find employment in the city. After begging for work and failing, they got used to the task of begging for alms. The mute girl, we must say, was sad at leaving her parents' side. The stump-armed beggar, who rolled all over her in the dark under the shadow cast by a house, was now her only support, a support that was feeble and falling apart by the minute. It was just 10 days since they had eloped. Today, on the 11th day, she discovered that she was alone. She felt like she was desperately shouting for help in a bottomless pit where there was not a blade of grass for her to clutch at. Her eyes kept flowing the entire day. She squeezed her stomach in grief, banged her forehead against a wall. She walked aimlessly but could not find him. By now, he would have got onto a train and left for another place, without a ticket, of course. Kani walked to the lake by the side of the railway station. She sat there with her feet in the water. She pulled a comb from her blouse and combed her hair, wetting it with the waters of the lake. After taking a gulp of water from the lake itself, she started walking past the bandh. She had a frail body, and no one would call her exactly good-looking. But she was buxom for her age. For people who craved flesh, she was a sumptuous meal. Walking, she turned askance to check behind her. Someone was following with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. Just when the street lamps lit up, she looked at those lights in wonder, as if a new world had opened up in front of her. A cyclist went past. A policeman's whistle shrilled in the distance. She turned again to see. He was still following her. She stood below the deodar tree on the footpath. He too came close and held out a packet of snacks. Her throat emitted some chuckling noises. She opened the packet and gobbled the food he had brought. He lit another cigarette. He said, "I've been watching you since morning." She understood him by the quiver of his lips. A cackling sound fell on her eardrums, but made no sense. She answered him in her monosyllabic noises. Tears started welling up within her. He made some sounds of sympathy and gestured her to follow him. She followed him with her head bent faithfully like a dog. Thus, under some unknown shelter that night, gave way to day. Some 4 days went by like this. He braided her hair and decked her up. Using a mix of phrases and gestures, he explained to her slowly, "I will bring new people. You should be silent and not open your mouth. No one needs to know that you are mute." She whined. She was livid when he gestured to say that she was mute, but all her anger subsided with her whines. He brought someone with him who looked like a respectable man. He grinned in front of the man and stooped low. Like a dog's eye on a bone, his eye was fixed on the man's wallet. One of the men who came was a true beast. His violent overtures hurt Kani. Unable to bear the pain, she wailed loudly, making her dumb noises, and pushed him away with both her hands and dropped him to the floor. This led to an altercation. Her master beat her like a dog. She crumpled into a corner and sat there with a broken face. The man who had come went away in anger. In the middle of the night, he lifted her from the floor and put her on a pallet. "Did it hurt?" he asked. She didn't answer him, but her eyes betrayed bizarre emotions. The mean-minded fellow could not fathom that. After that, Kani became very gentle. She did not love him in the least. She did not love anyone like she did her first love, the beggar with a stump for an arm. Kani did not understand money. She did not know what her earnings were. 2 saris, a blouse, a jumper, a tattered woolen lady's overcoat for her nightly visits, some flowers for her hair, and odorous oil to braid it with, a filling meal every day. The days passed thus. Thank heavens, she did not end up pregnant. On some days, however, her grief would flow over. She would toss about where she lay. She would remember her village, the hut she was born in, the people who spoke her language, the first partner, the man with the stump for an arm. She would wail in grief. For 2 nights, her wailing would not stop. No customer would come her way. One morning at dawn, she bundled some foodstuff and clothes into a knot and ran away. She reached the other end of the city and went out. She drifted into a village on the outskirts of the city. Her eyes met a pair of oxen and farmers busy at their tilling. She watched everything silently. It did not even occur to her that she had to comb her ruffled hair. Neither did she feel like looking at herself in a small 1-paisa mirror. Nor did she feel like having food. The ground all around her was sprouting green after a recent shower of rain. Kani sat down on fresh grass at a distance from the fields. Her mind flooded with 100 different memories from her childhood. Her face grew dark. Slowly, feeling drowsy, she lay there on the bare earth. It was evening by the time she awoke to voices of farmer women nudging her. As darkness fell, the village appeared to be a scary place. She walked back to the city. At the very edge of the city was a school, deserted at night. She found a place near the parapets and went to sleep. At daybreak, she woke up and walked away, smoothing her rough hair and decorating herself with the knickknacks which she carried with her. After strolling around for a few hours, it seemed like she had gained some acquaintance with the place. She saw a vast field with grass sprouting all over, an intersection, a municipal fountain right at the center, a statue of someone, and a lone building at the far end. Kani gave a few coins to a hawker selling groundnuts by the corner and bought some. Thus did she learn something about money, but the groundnuts hardly subdued her hunger. At the fall of darkness, Kani came back to the intersection and sat in a corner. A lonesome lamppost in the middle glowed faintly. A few who walked past turned to look at her. Some walked a few paces and then turned back to steal a glance. A man who looked respectable walked past a second time. Adjusting his glasses, Kani got up and walked away towards a tree and some thin shrubbery. The man followed her with stealthy glances. The next day, Kani learned that exchanging the piece of paper, she could fetch her snacks and a meal and also a few coins in return. How much and how exactly were matters beyond her. From then on, it was a new routine. Mornings were spent in aimless strolls, and in the evenings, an acquaintance or two by the intersection, and then by night in the shrubs on the green grass, dying a couple of times every day. Dying and coming back to life again. Coming back to life to die the next evening. Her days were spent in this manner. She did not have a reckoning of the kinds of men who came to her, drunkards, bastards, lost souls in search of clandestine joys, lecherous men who donned the cloak of respectability in the mornings, those who wanted to escape the banality of their homes and marriages. Was she not mute? She could have understood a thing or two about them and their worlds. But now, these matters made little sense to her. She could have understood something of all this had she at least had a glimpse of their faces. But in the dark, faces were hardly visible. She knew not whether these things were humane or beastly, nor would she know of matters of love and lust. Whether they were men with sprouting mustaches or men old and lame made little difference to her. When her body was fatigued, she would wail in pain. Her aches would send out strange noises of grief from within her. What occurred in the minds of men who seek pleasure from a mute woman on the street was beyond her. Whatever happened, happened like clockwork. She was little more than a breathing machine. The rain became heavy and there were no customers in sight. Slowly her earnings dwindled. Kani grew frail and weak. She started walking up to people and seeking them out. Her cheeks dropped and her eyes grew vacant and dark. A fever was rising in her. She adorned herself more intensely to fight it off. From a distance, with a woolen coat and flowers in her hair, she looked just about bearable. But if one were to see her up close, her eyes looked like they were dancing, like ghosts. Some louts would come over to the school where she slept at night, but would not give her a paisa in return. She would pick a fight with them, but they would pester her endlessly and rape her. Their rapacious laughs and beastly howls would make Kani shudder. When her protests became pointless, she would resign to her fate and submit to them. Her fever increased. She felt a voice within her telling her not to take those baths at the lake. But before long, her skin was afflicted with a strange disease. The young Kani suffered. Her body began giving off a foul odor. Kani changed her shelter. She walked towards a rundown hut a furlong away. There, a middle-aged beggar had built for himself his own palace. He fed her some gruel for 3 days. She gaped at the sky through the holes in the thatch roof as she fell asleep. On the 4th day, the fever appeared to subside. She sat up. The beggar looked at her with desire. Her face did not betray a trace of emotion. She had become incapable of experiencing emotion a long time ago. He skipped his begging rounds for the day and stayed back with her. His diseased body seemed to be making good on all the desire it had missed out on. In the evening, with a black overcoat upon her, Kani walked past the field and stood by its edge, where it was dark. She was feeling faint. The piece of land they once tilled, her mother, her father, the stump-armed lover, all of them walked past in a procession in her mind's eye. The brother who had left to become a coolie in Madras and the one who had left home in a fit of anger seemed to be hailing her from a distance. She was filled with grief. Unable to stand for long, she collapsed upon the ground. In the distance, the groundnut hawker's kerosene lamp glimmered and called out to her, but she did not have even a paisa. She wanted to snatch fistfuls of groundnuts and gobble them up, but she did not have the strength for it. It was 1 in the night. Before long, it turned past. Everyone who was strolling near the fountain left for their homes. Kani looked at each one of them with beseeching eyes. A man stood there alone. He was heavily built and had a wicked glint in his eye. He gestured to her with his hands. Kani stood up with great effort and pulled herself behind him. He seemed to be new to this. He pinned her just by the side of the shrubs. Kani tripped and a guttural sound escaped her. This irritated the man and he was quickly on his feet, brushing himself. He spat at her with scorn. Kani tried to sit up, but she had no energy left. He spat at her again and left without paying. Kani opened her mouth as if to wail loudly, but no sound emerged. She tried to stand up again, but could not manage it. He was walking away with quick strides. Finally, she managed to find her feet. She chased him like a mother would chase a villain stealing her child. She wailed in a hoarse voice and kicked up a fuss. He was running away without paying her. She was beseeching him with her babble to not deceive her. She was crying out to him, saying, "Do not cheat me of tomorrow's meal." He looked back at her with dread. Some people were still around. What if they heard? What if someone came up, tapped him on the shoulder, and asked him to explain himself? He stopped abruptly and returned. Clutching her throat, he pushed her to the ground and swore at her. "Dirty bitch." He kicked her in the stomach. Kani collapsed in an instant. There were howls in her throat, but they were not audible. There was still some breathing, slow first and then rare. Her final breaths were more labored. Everyone was on the move. No one had time to stop. Someone said the municipal van would come by to pick up the corpse. Up above in the skies, a vulture circled and spiraled down. Kani lay with her eyes open as if keenly observing it. The vulture was slowly closing in to alight upon her last customer.
Thank you, Reenadi. That's just a very powerful but small glimpse into what this book contains. And I, for one, look forward to picking up my copy. We'd like to move into the discussion now, and very briefly to introduce you to the panelists. Ruchira Gupta, who has edited this book and put the anthology together, A Real Labor of Love, is the founder and president of Apne Aap Women Worldwide, a grassroots organization in India working to end sex trafficking by increasing choices for at-risk girls and women. She also has many other hats, including teaching. Sitting next to Ruchira is Madhurima Sinha, who has contributed a story to this book. She is a well-known face in Calcutta, the director of public relations and marketing at Taj, and also a filmmaker whose short film has recently been doing the festival circuit and who is planning several more. Next, we see Nayonika Mukherjee. Nayonika is a reader of sociocultural anthropology in at Durham University, UK. She has published extensively on her research areas, which are the anthropology of violence, gendered violence during wars, ethics and aesthetics. She has been awarded the Mahatma Gandhi Pravasi Samman at the House of Lords for her contribution to social anthropology. Ratnotama Sengupta is a journalist who has contributed to newspapers like The Telegraph, Indian Express, and The Times of India as the arts editor. She won the National Award for Writings on Cinema in 2001, And Ratnotamadi is very closely involved with the cinema world as a writer and a critic and a scholar of cinema. And Aparna Sen I did not introduce because we know her so well, but for those of you who may not have acquainted themselves with her work till now, she is one of the country's most respected filmmakers, a very, very fine actor on stage and on screen. And she is the winner of 3 National Film Awards, 9 International Film Festival Awards for her filmmaking, and she also is a Padma Shri. So I would invite Ratnotama to begin the discussion. We have about 20 minutes of discussion and then a few questions.
So, thank you all of you for being here with us today. Thanks, APJ, for the festival that brings us all together. And since we have about 20 minutes in all, so we'll take one questions first for each of them, and then we'll come back to Rinali. Madhurima,
Just one second. We're not having a second reading, if that's what you're asking. With this, Reenati has chosen that one story to read. Yeah. So we have the full 20 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, certainly. I wasn't.
A
aware.
very
Yeah,
short excerpt.
Sure.
I
Then we
was
can end with that. I
requesting.
think.
Okay.
Yeah. That'll be nice.
I'll start with Madhurima.
Yes.
You are the author of one of the stories here. This book has stories, 21 stories from 12 languages. And the theme shows that this has been the topic, human trafficking, prostitution, has been the concern of thinking writers down the years and in every part of the country and on the subcontinent. You're part of a legacy. How do you see this legacy? I mean, where does your time and your content fall?
To be honest, I'm very humbled by this whole experience and pretty intimidated. And it happened, there is a way it happened. Actually, Ruchira and I, when she first told me about this project, she had seen a short film which I had made, and she wanted me to make a short film on one of the stories. We had selected one of the stories, and we were actually making a film, and we were fully ready, and it was going to be, we were going to start shooting. 2 weeks before the film was going to be shot, the author withdrew his rights for the story. So everything fell through. But we had made a lot of preparations. So this particular story, which is included in this anthology of mine, is actually part of a different set altogether. A book which is yet to be published, is coming out by end of the year, a set of short stories. It was part of that. So I picked up this story actually and wrote a script out for the film, because a lot of groundwork was done and we were determined to go ahead with it. That's when Ruchira decided to include this story in this anthology. I was a little skeptical initially because of, as you say, the legacy and the kind of authors were included. But the publisher and Ruchira finally managed to convince me. And there it is now for everybody to read. And it is also going to be made into a short
Very
film in a
briefly,
while.
can you just say how the protagonist and her situation, has it remained same in contemporary times, or has it changed for Ketwa?
This protagonist is, the story is actually a contemporary story about somebody, a younger girl, a young woman in her 30s who discovers a family secret, something about her father. And this is about a woman who was a Tawaif in Lucknow and was brought to Calcutta and was here as her father's mistress, really, to use a common term. And so it is about a young woman, a contemporary woman, and her reaction to a woman who was with her father and she didn't know about it. She discovers it at an adult age, and her response. And she is responding in a different way. She treats the woman in a different way. But she discovers at the end of the story that, which is what Ratnotama is actually asking me, that when women are used, no matter how well they are apparently treated, ultimately at the core, they remain either the other woman, or there is a degree of violence, if not physical violence, but emotional violence of some sort, however subtle it may be.
Thanks. Nanika, you are based in the West and you've read the book, which has primarily stories by writers on the subcontinent. What did you find? What is common and what is different in the situation of the prostituted women? Also, I would like you to place this in the context of the sexual choices and freedom, less inhibition in the West with the body.
First of all, thank you for asking me to be part of this panel. Someone who teaches stuff on gender and sexuality is a war. It was very interesting to read it. A significant collection. One thing in answering your question, I just want to kind of clarify about this West, non-West, West freedom of the body versus non-West exploitation of the body. I think that's a distinction I don't recognize. There's equally as much of exploitation or freedom on both sides in different ways, in different constellations. So I wouldn't go with that binary at all. But in reading this this collection, one of the things that I was struck by, a couple of things, and I just then want to kind of pose back a question maybe for all of us or generally, and what becomes very significant along with the experiences of the figure of the prostitute or sex worker. You know, there's a big debate, the prostitution sex work debate, but along with the figure of the woman, there is also the various kind of roles of the matriarchs, the various the mothers and the madams who are also entrenched in the system and ensuring the hygiene and the well-being and the beautification of the women, while also worrying that they would leave for domesticity with someone else. At the same time, there's also, I found interesting, the various figures of the men, right? Whether they are the horrible customers to the kind customers, or the pimps, or the state actors like the inspectors. And one thing I was really struck by the story of the doll for the child prostitute, where the inspector, who's this horrible figure initially, who's angry with one of the women who's run away with this young student who would come and talk politics to the prostitute in question, and they run away, and he's angry because she never allowed him to touch her, but she's now gone away. So he's abusive of that, but at the same time, he just turns around when he's going for this really young girl. He decides to become the grandfatherly figure at the end of the story and gets her this girl whom you press and says, "Mommy, mommy." You know, it's a story at so many levels it can be unpacked. But I was struck by the various kinds and the variety of figures that actually exist among the various kinds of protagonists one can think of, and the variety of life that comes through in the life of sex work, prostitution. One of the questions I had was in thinking about Ruchira's introduction is I think there's a way to think about this between the exploitation choice spectrum, and there is a kind of blurred line between the coercion consent debate, whether one comes and there are structural inequalities also to think about in terms of what makes women come to red light districts, to brothels by their own choice. And I talk about this with a little bit of experience of having worked with a sex worker who was based in Tanbajar. This is the Narayanganj red light district in Bangladesh, and she had been raped during the Bangladesh war in 1971. And one of the things she comes up and says is, I try to stay away from here. She tries various kinds of business, but she tries to stay away from there. But then she comes, what she calls it, the Sheshimana, the last boundary. But she says, I came here to look for love. এখানে ভালো মন্দ অনেক লোক আসে, there's lots of different kind of people who come here, and out of them I'll find someone and set up domesticity. And the trope of domesticity actually runs pretty strongly through the book in terms of whether people are flying away, going away, or trying to set up, or the search of the elusive sons mostly of not daughters. I haven't come across the daughters, but the elusive son who's going to come back to the mother. The waiting for the letters, waiting for the return of various figures. So I just think there is an interesting debate to raise beyond the exploitation and the choice debate. The choice is never a free choice. The exploitation is never a sheer exploitation. It is in some instance, but there is also a much more nuanced account to be made of how we think of sex work and prostitution debate.
Thanks, Nayanika. Ruchira, I think Nayanika has brought us directly to the purpose of the book. What led you to the book and the choice of the title, and you describing them as the prostituted women and not sex workers. Can you please throw some more light on this?
Absolutely. I'm an activist, and I began life as a journalist. I was traveling through the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages which didn't have any girls from age 15 to 45. And I began to look for the answer to that, and I found that the flesh trade existed in my lifetime, in my generation, in my country. I followed the trail to the brothels of Bombay, ended up making a documentary, The Selling of Innocence, and that was a life-changing experience for me because I talked to the women inside the brothels of Bombay and asked them what their lives were like, why they were there, what did they want, what their dreams were. And at that time, the women in prostitution told me 4 things. They said they had 4 dreams. And the first was they wanted school for their children. And I said, why do you want a school for your child? And they said, whatever has happened to us has happened. We don't want the same future for our children. Just as you heard Payal today and Rinku today say the same thing. The next thing they said was they wanted a job in an office. And I asked them, I said, what does a job in an office mean? It seemed so far away from the hovels and the ghettos of Bombay with iron bars on the window. And they said, oh, where we can just work 9 to 5, where we have old age pension, where it's clean, nobody beats us and shouts us, and there are fixed working hours and a fixed monthly salary. And of course, anybody wants a job in their office, in an office. The third thing they said they wanted, which was, I was an English literature student, so it really rang true for me. They said we wanted a room of our own, just like Virginia Woolf. And that's where I agree with Nayanika that it cut through cultures, boundaries, borders, countries, east, west, everything. And I said, what does that mean again to them? And they said something which is just this big. We promise we'll stop drinking alcohol, but somewhere where our children can play safely on the floor, where nobody can walk in when they want to. A customer decides when he comes. The girl can't decide whether she will take him or not. And where nobody beats them, shouts at them. And the fourth thing they said was they wanted justice. And I said, what does justice mean? It seemed so remote with the sheer sort of rape for profit, commercial rape going on in Kamtipura and Bombay. And they said 2 things. They said nobody was there to watch out for them when they were pulled into prostitution. There were young girls who were pulled out of school and put into a brothel. And they said, their fathers, their brothers, their husbands took decisions about their bodies, about their lives, whether they would be sold into prostitution. They said nobody was there to watch out for them. And they would have liked to be protected at that time. Somebody to ask, where is this girl being taken to, what's happening to her? And investment, to be kept in school. And the other thing they said, they wanted those who had brokered away their dreams to be punished. So, the people who bought them and sold them, the traffickers, the recruiters, the transporters. So based on that, I quit journalism. I won an Emmy for outstanding investigative journalism, but it seemed irrelevant. And started Apne Aap, which means self-empowerment in Hindi. And in the last 18 years, I've organized more than 20,000 women and girls across our country, Bombay, Delhi, Bihar. And every time I hear certain things which are patterns now for me. The same thing about school, room of our own, justice, all of that. And I have been struggling because wherever I traveled, my feminist friends would say, but you're on the wrong side of the debate because women are making this choice to be sex workers.
Right.
And I began to look for the answer that where was this choice? And exactly as Noenika said, the choice is really absence of choice. Prostitution is absence of choice. And it is because we fail to invest in the last girl, our state. Our government, is cutting budgets for women and children. Boarding schools are being cut. Child labor is being legalized by the present government. Food is being cut. Midday meals, school uniforms are being cut. So, the failure to invest in what I call the last girl, who's poor, who's female, who's low caste and a teenager. Everything is being taken away from her, and then she's told that now you're choosing to be a sex worker because you show up there. And again, like Noenika said, in Bangladesh, a girl who's already raped during the war, and she's going from pillar to post to survive. And she ends up there. And again, exactly the story that Aparna Sen chose, the last customer. She has no choice when the customer is going to come, how many will use her. Her body could be stinking, and she will still be exploited. So I wanted to convey this culturally to people, to understand absence of choice, to empathize with the last girl, and not accept a livelihood which we would not accept for our daughters. How can we accept it for them? And to treat them like mainstream citizens, not to stigmatize and marginalize them, but also to make sure that they have other options other than prostitution. So I began to look for stories. This was a 5-year hunt for stories. Some I discarded, some I kept. Sunil Gangopadhyay has written powerful, powerful stories. Mahashweta D's son has written a story called Parijat and Baby K, which I did not take in this. But the ones I selected were the ones which rang true for me because they were exactly the same things which women in prostitution were telling me. And, they were saying, we hate the smelly feet of our customers. Now, people would not remember that. They would think, oh, it's kind of romantic. He's giving her some money or whatever. Or, what Aparna Sen's choice of story. That here are these customers who are coming and coming and coming, and there's no end. And all she's earning is a sari. A
Or a
place to
meal,
sleep
next
in.
day's
So really
meal.
this myth, this urban legend that prostitution offers an income, actually the prostituted woman is kept in debt bondage, and the income is made off her body by the prostitution system, the brothel keeper, the pimp, all the people who control her. And the thing is, it's not an occupation that you earn more as you grow older, you earn less. So the shelf life of a prostituted woman, the commercial viability is for 4 or 5 years. And then you're left with nothing to do. So therefore, I deliberately, to start a dialogue, to start a discourse, I decided to call the book River of Flesh and Other Stories. River of Flesh is the title of one of the stories by Kamleshwar, who also talks about the stinking body of a prostitute, just like Niranjana talks about it in his story. And the prostituted woman in Indian fiction, I deliberately chose it because language is politics. And I want to introduce a new thought for us to be able to empathize with that last girl, to understand it's not her choice. Somebody is taking advantage of her vulnerabilities, her absence of choice, her poverty, her caste, her age, her femaleness, and putting her into this situation. So just to remind people of that, I've chosen the word the prostituted woman.
Thanks, Ruchira, for making it so clear. Can I just add one story to that? I was in Berlin and I was going through the newspapers, being a journalist, we always do. And there was this story about a woman. This was right after prostitution had been legalized in Germany. And there was this story about this woman who had applied for a job. And when she went there, she found it was a job in a brothel. She had to be a prostitute. And she refused the job. Now, when she comes back and after a few days, she finds that she has been taken off the security system, security social benefit, because she had been given a job, a legalized job, and she had refused it. So when we talk about choices, this is the irony, and when we talk about legalization once more, this I found so telling that I have always hesitated personally to use the word sex worker. It's not a job. And this was once again when I was with the Sansa Board. I thank all of you. I think we've virtually come to the end of it. I will end by requesting Rinadi to read a very short portion from a story, Market Price. It's a personal request. I've translated 2 stories in the book. One is by Shubodh Ghosh, Barbodhu, which is very well known in Bengal, and the other is Market Price, Bajar Dor by Nobendu Ghosh, who happened to be my father. And this is a very personal request, but this will once again highlight, both the stories highlight the domesticity aspect of what Nonika had mentioned. It's page 155.
I apologize if there are mistakes because I haven't had a chance to go through this story before. I'm just reading it first time off. Chaya had accompanied her mother when she made her way to Calcutta after the partition. She was married into a decently middle-class family. Her husband had a steady job in a factory nearby. But before she could notch up 2 years of married life, her husband died of smallpox. Her mother couldn't reconcile herself to Chaya's widowhood. She too bought a ticket to heaven. With the little treasure trove left by her mother and her husband and the uninhibited appeal of her uncontrollable youth, she was reduced to a slave in her brother-in-law's household. And aunt-in-law was her worst enemy. A couple of years down, her brother-in-law audaciously turned down every marriage proposal and started eyeing her greedily. Every time he spoke to her, his words were lined with double entendre. Initially, Chaya ignored his overtures. When she openly objected to his advances, her aunt-in-law uttered a single word, whore. At this juncture, a Jatra group put up a performance in their para. Kurukshetra, the play was titled. Chaya watched Balaram enact the role of Arjun. She was charmed. She was not oblivious to all that has been drilled into every Hindu widow down the centuries. But why had the words lost their edge? From the neighborhood gossip, Chaya gleaned that Balaram lived close by and, at that point of time, was unemployed. One day, she ran into Balaram. Noting the deep curiosity in her eyes, Balaram followed her to the doorstep. Then, on every single afternoon when the aunt-in-law was enjoying her siesta and the brother-in-law was away at work, Chaya would stand at her window and find Balaram keeping a watch. At first, Chaya would shut the window. Later, she would leave it open. One afternoon, from his post outside her window, Balaram smiled at her. Another day, Chaya smiled back. Some days later, on the pretext of going to the Kalighat temple, Chaya met him at the Maidan. They spoke and they spoke. After listening to her story, he proposed marriage. He urged her to elope with him. After a lot of conflict, and when she could no longer ward off her greedy brother-in-law's overtures, she resolved to join Balaram. Yes, by now, she too was feverishly anticipating the hour of their union. So, one afternoon when she stepped out ostensibly to buy some household item, she took with her a bag containing some saris and her jewelry. When they arrived in Kashi, they spent a month in a hotel. In the meantime, they rented this place and moved in. They also quickly exchanged garlands in front of some gods. A local Brahmin, Balaram had arranged, was the sole witness to this marriage. 6 months had elapsed since that day. Every effort to get a job that has so far eluded them will come to fruition now. O Lord Vishwanath of Kashi, please take mercy on us. Since she met Balaram, Chaya had found a new meaning in life. Her Balaram is charm personified. But why is he taking so long to buy a cigarette? Must have struck up an adda with some stranger at the pawn shop. Don't we know how he loves to chat with his friends? Whose footfall was that in the lane? Chaya peeped out of the door. No, it isn't him. Chaya ruminated for a while, then put the latch on the door. Let him come back, she'll teach him a lesson. She'll simply keep him waiting at the door. Balaram will have to play out The Manbhanjan sequence in the Radha Krishna Jatra, where he pleads guilty to her and urges her to relent and make love to him. Chaya smiled to herself. She brought out the bottle of perfume from her chest. The tiny room was redolent with a heady scent that percolated into her consciousness and piqued her desire for his tight embrace. She sharpened the enticement in her eyes with a fresh coat of kajol. Balaram doesn't quite know the magnetic power of her sexuality. At that very moment, Balaram is at the Kashi station. He's bought a ticket to Kolkata, looks around him to check if he recognizes anyone, then lights a cigarette. Walking towards platform number 4 in order to board the last train to Mughal Sarai, he keeps planning his next move. Kolkata would be the best place to hide in. It's easy to be anonymous amidst hundreds of thousands. He feels the inner pocket of his coat. Ah, the sweet sensation of currency notes. 1100 rupees, almost. Enough to sustain him for the next few months. By then, he would work out a new arrangement. Given the hard times we're going through, it's impossible to carry on an affair for longer than 6 months. The exchange of garlands, a mere ritual, a game of sorts, nothing more. But Balaram isn't heartless. He's left Chaya with nearly 150 rupees and an enviable storehouse of sexuality. Surely her youth won't evaporate overnight like camphor. Besides, he's leaving her in Kashi, the lord of Shiva. It's a holy city where thousands descend every day for pilgrimage. The complex network of narrow, dingy lanes. Balaram comes to a halt on platform number 4. The signal is down, emitting a green light made hazy by the misty winter. Letting out a mouthful of smoke that's lost its way in the darkness of the January night, Balaram lets out a deep sigh. Poor Chaya. Such a sweet soul she was, and so pretty. He was sorry to abandon the curious warmth of her firm, youthful body. His only consolation is that she'll stay on in his memories, the memories of intimate nights and playful days. And Chaya too won't easily forget him, the memory of Tinkori Das, aka Balaram Chaudhuri, who charmed her as Arjun, will grow day by day inside her womb. It will continue to grow after it comes out of her womb. It will continue to grow and gnaw at her soul until her last breath. No, Chaya will not forget Balaram, even if he forgets her.
Thank you very much, Reenadi. We will now, just a minute, what is that?
Ruchira wants me to read one small portion from her introduction, which of course all of you will read, to just complete the session before we do the Q&A.
Okay.
The term sex worker cannot erase the trauma of body invasion, nor can any kind of legislation do away with the shock of body penetration. There is no glossing over the fact that prostitution is an inherently exploitative practice, more akin to slavery than to occupation. As a feminist and campaigner for social justice, these stories, as well as the lived experiences of the women I meet, have only strengthened my belief that women do not choose prostitution. They are prostituted. River of Flesh and other stories, The Prostituted Woman, in Indian short fiction, is our attempt to denormalize the efforts to legitimize the exploitation of women.
Thank you. Shall we just take some... Yeah, we really are running out of time, so very briefly.
I just wanted to add to that in terms of thinking about what Rumki Napayal said in the morning. She referred to herself baje hoye gechen. I think rather than baje hoye gechen, bhalo, kharap, instead of that, there's a lot of hypocrisy of society which also leads to exploitation and prostitution itself. So আপনাদের ভালো খারাপের থেকে সমাজের যে hypocrisy, that is a lot to blame for what happens to women who decide to go or end up in prostitution. So I think that's a big point to make and not just about the women themselves. So,
Any questions from the audience? Yes, there's a hand here. Who's holding the mics for the audience? Can you just ask loudly? But yeah, take this.
First, I will like to. It's out of this world that something of this seriousness an issue of this seriousness has been taken up by AKLF. It's gratitude from all the people who are curious to understand what it is like, how the lives are there. I just want to know, like, from the stage of AKLF, what kind of resolution can we take to provide that support, that giving the hand of support to all those people. Maybe we have filmmakers here, we have
Okay.
industrialists
So are you
here.
asking this question to me? Are you asking me?
The whole stage of AKLF.
Okay,
like
so
how
since
can
I'm
we-
the only AKLF person on stage at the moment, I shall have to answer. Speaking personally, as a director of the festival, I think that as a literary festival, one can try and create a space where this kind of subject can be debated with total seriousness, and also where the literary and the creative attempts to grapple with the issue. As we've seen, it's a very complicated issue. It involves state, it involves individual, it involves society, and at least to recognize that this is an issue which is very important, and to be able to bring people together who, whether intellectually or creatively, are trying to deal with the issue. I think that is probably what a literary festival can at least try to do. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Ma'am, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on the amazing book. See, I have a twofold question. The first one being that I might sound very, very crude and I might as well just objectify a woman, but I will just state plain facts as to what I think. This is just subject to what I think. See, there is a basic supply and demand rule in everything, right? So, because there is a demand and there is a lack of willful supply, there is black marketing. And that is what prostitution and trafficking is all about. So, when we say that we'll help the woman, we will help the women who are being trafficked, who are being wrongfully and taken as a given that, okay, nobody wants prostitution willingly. But the point is, ma'am, as an industry, it is an industry, it is an established industry. And there is a demand. What will you do about the demand? You can always curb the supply. But what about the demand? There is a man who is, and does it not owe substantially to the fact that the sex ratio of the country 944 is to 1000? Do we not owe it to, I mean, whatever it is, a man can't find a woman to make love, that is why he goes and rapes another. I mean, I'm not justifying anything, I'm just asking what do we do about the demand? And ma'am, secondly, I checked all the internship you are offering, but you're not offering any internships currently, so will you please let me work with you?
For the internship part, the director of Apne Aap is sitting there, Tinku, so you can go and negotiate with her just after the session. And in terms of the demand, Apne Aap has a huge campaign called Cool Men Don't Buy Sex. And we are trying to get into colleges and universities to launch this dialogue. We've been doing it for about 4 years. And college to college has been calling us. And we have t-shirts saying Cool Men Don't Buy Sex, which men wear. They wear wristbands, they do signature campaigns and send it out. And our attempt at feminism is to go beyond the binary of the masculine and the feminine, because we have a man within us and a woman within us, in all of us. We are made of a father and a mother, right? But I am taught to block out the man in me, and men are taught to block out the feminine in them. And so how do we get beyond that is to think about, can men become caregivers and can women become breadwinners? And how do we free men from having the burden of earning all the time and being told that they're sissy if they are not earning? You know, that's also very, very tough for men. So we have to go beyond this binary and change all stereotypes. I would love more men to be inside the home and more women to be in public places. And this whole idea of control around sexuality to go away. We are in a gender fluid time right now. And, we can totally explore so much more in our generation than we've done before. We don't need to create stereotypes at all.
And I was just wondering, I mean, I know this debate has gone on pretty long, but what happens to transgenders?
Exactly.
That's a very, very important area.
And in fact, there are 2 lanes in Kamtipura, 2 lanes in Sonagachi, which are of transgender people. But the buyers are always men because of the power inequality. So what this book is trying to highlight is the power inequality, and that all inequalities have to be rooted out together.
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions. One is Oindrila here, one is Rima there, and then we'll halt the session.
Ruchira, a far more complex problem, but this is a real example that I'm giving you. An organization like All Bengal Women's Union brings back rescued women. A lot of them don't want to be rescued. They don't want to be at that organization because they want that soap, they want that sari, they want that hair oil. How do you deal with that?
Just pass her the mic.
Yeah, it is. Their families anyway.
More often it's because the families won't accept them once they are
I'm
sullied.
Dr. Tama, we've gone beyond that. Let's say they have been sold by families. In most cases, it is people they trust or look up to who betray them or who sell them. But having done that, one would think that they would want to be rescued from their life, but a lot of them don't. This is a real problem being faced by one organization that I am mentioning. And I'm sure you've come across this situation. So how do you deal with that?
Well, basically, I don't like the word rescue because I find it kind of patronizing. And my struggle is actually for myself because I feel that if exploitation is legitimized and lesser livelihoods which are inherently exploitative because they're based on body invasion become normal, then one day even my exploitation is going to become normal because it's just a cascading effect from one to the other. And for example, in Bengal, you have this ritual where somebody goes and takes a mud full of sand to make the Durga Pratima during
That's
puja.
from a
And
sex
I think
worker.
it's a very patriarchal society which is sending a message to all women that either we are going to domesticate you, and even if you try to become Shakti, we will turn you into this person who knows that she's going to be controlled. By getting someone we have completely subjugated and used sand from her house. So it's a message to everybody that you're not really Shakti. And during puja time. So I think it is very difficult to talk about rescue in this situation unless we can rescue ourselves, all of us, from patriarchy itself, the inequality of patriarchy. And for the woman who's in the shelter, because the shelters are very badly run, they don't, it's being like sort of semi-prison-like state, and every human being wants freedom. And they want to be able to make their own choices in whatever limited capacity they have. The problem is that prostitution is not an occupation in which you earn more with more experience. You earn less. The commercial viability of a prostituted woman ends by the time she's in her late 20s, and she's very often thrown out on the sidewalk and told to replace herself with her daughter. So in any case, there is no question of rescue, there is no question of re-trafficking, and the major investment, I would say, has to be in the most marginalized girls and women, so that we need to invest in their education, in their jobs, in their housing, all of that. And, this is after the fact. After they've completely been brutalized for 5 years, there are 10 customers a night. Can you imagine what that does to her mentally and physically? Research now shows that, prostituted women suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is worse than returning war veterans. So, obviously she's traumatized, she can't figure out what to do. And in terms of consumerism, what you were talking about, that are they buying lipstick or shoes or soap or whatever, remember that the prostituted woman is only snatching at some kind of dignity. She's looking for a soap or a lipstick or a sari, some flash of happiness through a product, respectability. But men are buying her. She's buying a soap, shoes, purse. So there's a very big difference between the two. But we blame her for wanting that sari or that purse. The world is unequal that she has to sell her body for the purse, whereas a man will get any job and he doesn't have to sell anything to buy her.
I'll take one more question. Rima?
I find this work amazingly commendable, and I think this is, however, I work and write on prostitution colonies in Pakistan, and I think there's a clear difference between what the kind of buying of body that you're talking about. There are some areas, say the one in Karachi, where which is called Napier Road, and in a more poetic way, it's called Bulbul-e Hazar Dastan. nightingales of many stories, tales in translation. So that's a poor area, and I think this model, of course, applies in that area, but say it's something like the one in Lahore, which is called Shahi Mohalla, and that is descendants of the Mughals, you know, and those women are actually, that's a beautiful place to go to. It's not, they don't give you the impression that they are exploited or, you know, or there is tremendous empowerment in their own being, and I think at some level we need to salute that, you know, because they're calling the shots. They decide whether they want to stay there, and some of our, you know, most amazing and legendary movie stars have come from these areas, you know, in Pakistan. So, I mean, when I, just before coming to Calcutta, I went to to do a piece on the prostitution colony in Hyderabad, Sindh, and that's called Bazar-e-Husn, so they all have beautiful names. And over there, there's the most popular prostitute is a very beautiful lady, and she was abducted at the age of 10. And so she came into the sex trade at 10. 30 years later, she owns 2 homes outside the colony. This is a 300-year-old area. It was created for the British. And she owns 3 homes. She has 9 children. She has educated all of them, put them through college, and she doesn't know who the fathers are. And then there is one man, finally now, at this stage, at 41 or so, where she's found one man who's younger than her, and she goes home to or goes to him after working hours, and she hopes that, you know, there is this man who will give her children a more respectable or a different life and things. But the whole this is getting long, so I'll just the final the most interesting part of this of these colonies, I would say, is that we find more contracts of love amongst society. But when I go there and I talk to these women, I think the idealistic love, where you surrender to love and you don't have expectations in return, I found in numerous women across these colonies that I worked for.
So Rima, are you asking a question or are you drawing a contrast?
I feel that where there is one side where there is, you know, this terrible exploitation, where there is this invasion of body, where there is commercial bondage, there is this other side. What do you have to say about these women who are tremendously empowered, and they are the ones who ensure that entire society is so matriarchal. What do you say about the other side?
Do you want to answer that or take this offline too?
I'll answer a short one and then we can have a longer conversation later, but I think it needs to be addressed.
Yes, please.
So I'm coming to your country, and the next book launch of River of Flesh and other stories, The Prostituted Woman in Indian Fiction, is going to be in Lahore at the Oxford Bookstore on 2nd of February, and Salima Hashmi, Faiz's daughter, is going to launch it, and Asma Jahangir is going to discuss it. So I look forward to visiting Hiramandi, and then I'm going to the Karachi Lit Fest, so I hope to go to Napier Road too. I have activist friends from Pakistan, Yasmin Hassan, who now heads Equality Now, who actually learned dancing along with some of the women who have been prostituted. And she says, while there is a gloss put over their condition and their situation, that they are the happy hooker, just like Pretty Woman did with Julia Roberts. But behind that situation is actually still lack of choices, still control, still depending on the approval of men, the money that men can give. And the brothel managers who are the successful prostitutes are few and far between. And the story of those who are discarded and, eaten up by vultures, like in The Last Customer in this book, or just dying from the diseases picked up because of the repeated body invasion, and nothing can legislate that away. Those are the untold stories. Whereas the myth of the happy hooker, the few who become brothel managers, are mentioned. So this is my impression, and this is what I've learned from fellow activists in Pakistan. And, it's a feudal society. There was feudalism in Mughal Empire, and now we know where the Mughals are. Also living off railway stations and all of that. So we have to see if this is a romanticization of feudalism or is it really equality. And I hope to go to Pakistan and find that out. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay, very reluctantly, I have to call this session to a close. Please give a big round of applause to our wonderful panelists. And I would like to thank Town Hall for making available this absolutely spectacular setting. And we'd like to thank our partners, Faces and Open Doors, who have been helpful throughout the festival, Oxford Bookstores and the APJ Surendra Group for being behind us all the way. Thank you. Now, just to announce, we are running 5 minutes late for our next session, so please don't go away. We're going to have a quick cleanup of the stage and we'll be ready to start in a few minutes, okay? And I know that most of you know what's coming next. It's the release in Kolkata, the Kolkata release of the biography of Shatrughan Sinha, and we're all greatly looking forward to this event. So I invite you all to stay on. Thank you.